Well, good day, everyone, and welcome back to my series entitled Putting Enterprise Cyber Risk Management, ECRM, into Action. Please recall from the previous session that we used the concept of a use case to help set the stage for good discussion around some of the fundamentals of enterprise cyber risk management. And in that last episode, I used the use case of a radiology department attack to focus in on three key elements and the basis and the foundation of pretty much all the work that we do in enterprise cyber risk management. And those elements were confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And as I mentioned, if you want to cast it this way, we can look at the fundamental problem we're all trying to solve around enterprise cyber risk management is to assure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of all data systems and devices that hospitals create, receive, maintain, or transmit in the course of executing their responsibilities. Now, the HIPAA security rule very, very specifically uses these words and calls them out in what I call the preamble to the HIPAA security rule. It's actually at 45 CFR, Code of Federal Regulation, section part 164, section 306. Under security standards. And the requirements actually read, covered entities, and allow me to read this, and business associates must do the following. 1, ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of all electronic protected health information the covered entity or business associate creates, receives, maintains, or transmits. So is this series in my book, Stop the Cyber Bleeding, about compliance or about security? What I'll do in this episode is to examine the concept of compliance risk versus security risk and try to address, again, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Are we trying to be compliant, or are we trying to be secure, or are we trying to do both? Once again, as a reminder of where we are on our journey, and how we'll go about achieving our objectives and covering some of the themes in this series. This is the overall roadmap. We're in episode 2, where we're going to be talking about compliance risk versus security risk. As I mentioned earlier episodes, I'm contemplating between 25 and 30 episodes for the whole series. All of the episodes will be uploaded to this YouTube channel. If you've not already done so, you might consider subscribing to the channel so that you receive notifications of any new episodes or new materials that we may post. And as I've also suggested, feel free to share this YouTube channel with any of your friends and colleagues whom you believe may benefit from these discussions. So the short answer to the question about whether we're solving a compliance risk management or a security risk management issue is, of course, yes. It's all of the above, both. It includes the intersection, and we'll talk about these three things. So first of all, as a healthcare covered entity or a business associate, first and foremost, you have statutory obligations to comply with all of the HIPAA regulations, privacy, security, and breach notification. We're focused on security in this series and in this episode. But you may have other requirements as well that include, let's say you're an academic medical center, a Graham-Leach-Bliley. If you're working with or serving the requirements and the needs of European patients, you may be subject to GDPR. If you take credit cards or other payment cards, debit cards, you're probably subject to the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Who knows what the next set of regulations will be that constitute the compliance mosaic that we all deal with. So compliance risk management is all about meeting the requirements of those types of regulations. And frankly, what it boils down to over and over again is three things. Number one, for any of the aforementioned regulations, you need to have policies and procedures. Number two, you need to be able to demonstrate that you are actually fulfilling what you have written in your own internal policies and procedures, which ought to be in complete alignment with the regulation. And number three, you need to be able to demonstrate that whatever it is you're doing is reasonable and appropriate. So another way of saying it is it documented? Are you doing it? And is it reasonable and appropriate? That's what compliance risk management is all about. For example, if you have a risk analysis, which is the heart of what we're discussing in this series, and or a risk management policy and procedure, that happens to be a very core foundational requirement in the HIPAA security rule. And by the way, pretty much every other regulation that I've indicated here requires that you have a risk management and risk analysis policy and procedure. So that would be being able to show that you have it, that you're in fact doing it, abiding by it, and fulfilling it. And then last but not least, number 3, that whatever it is you're doing is reasonable and appropriate. Security risk management, on the other hand, as we said in the previous episode, is about assuring the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of all of that electronic protected health information, as well as the devices and systems that are used to create, receive, maintain, and transmit it. Now, what does this really mean when you're talking about security risk management? Number 1, it means you need to identify and prioritize all of your unique risk. Number 2, you need to set a risk appetite for your organization that is reasonable and appropriate to your organization. And last but not least, number 3, once you've identified and prioritized your risk, you need to make informed, quote unquote, risk management or risk treatment decisions. That is, are you going to accept risk? Are you going to avoid them? Are you going to mitigate them? Are you going to transfer them in some form? For example, in the case that we looked at in the previous episode around the radiology department hack, and very specifically the compromise of integrity of those CT scan images, in that particular scenario, we don't know everything there is to know about that environment. But clearly, there were weak physical safeguards and controls in terms of any risk treatment that may or may not have been done. And obviously, there were very weak technical controls as it related to having the ability for someone to attach an otherwise unknown endpoint device on that network and then have access to the entire radiology department, including the PACS system. So, having an incident occur in your environment is one matter, and that's maybe not bad enough. But if upon investigation, let's say you have an incident occur because of weaknesses in your physical, technical, or administrative controls, then if indeed as follow-up there's a compliance investigation, the matter is reported to the Office for Civil Rights as an example, you may not only have been in hot water over the attack that occurred, but you may be facing some compliance risk management issues as well. If indeed, as is commonly the case, in fact, I will say, buy you dinner if it's not the case, if you have an attack that involves electronic protected health information, you can be sure that the Office for Civil Rights is going to ask for a copy of your most recent risk analysis, and typically one for the previous 3 years that you may have done it. They're also going to ask for your risk management plan. If upon their requesting that, you can't produce the policy and procedure, well, you're going to have a hard time showing that you're doing, you're abiding by, following it, and enforcing it. And then last but not least, you're going to have a real hard time, if nothing exists, showing you're doing something reasonable and appropriate. So the two intersect. And the other point I would make before we leave this particular topic is that you may be in certain areas compliant, but not secure. On the other hand, you may be very secure and possibly not compliant from the point of view of having all the appropriate policies and procedures and documentation. It is in fact that latter case that we see more often than the former. And that is to say, someone may be doing a terrific job around, let's say, data backup and recovery, which is very explicitly called out in HIPAA security rule, but they may not have it documented very well in their policies or procedures. So leave this topic knowing that being compliant is not the same as being secure, being secure does not necessarily mean that you're compliant either. As we complete all the episodes in this series, we're going to be coming at both of those matters, the matter of compliance risk management and the matter of security risk management, in much more detail. Okay then, as I've mentioned, I will end each session with suggested actions as well as references and resources. I encourage you, while the material is still fresh in your mind, to take a look at them. And while we're not grading this series in any manner, shape, or form, it's adult education, you might undertake some of these actions in your own environment to help stimulate further discussion. One thing I want to emphasize, since this series is all about enterprise cyber risk management, the core of which is doing risk-based work. Just think about the compliance requirements for covered entities and business associates, that is, those organizations that are part of the healthcare ecosystem. From the point of view of risk analysis, HIPAA requires it. GDPR, it doesn't call it a risk analysis, it calls it a data protection impact assessment. The payment card industry data security standard at requirement 12.2 requires risk analysis. A Graham-Leach-Bliley Act requires risk analysis. And let's not forget academic medical centers and FERPA, which also has a requirement for risk analysis. In other words, again, our ECRM work is all about both compliance risk management and cyber risk management. In the next episode, we'll take up the concept of HIPAA standard of care. The broader legal concept of standard of care we'll cover in some future episodes, but next week it's going to be HIPAA standard of care, and specifically 3 elements that define it: reasonable diligence, the place you want to live, reasonable cause, we're now slipping in the wrong direction, and worst of all, so-called willful neglect. So until then, subscribe to the YouTube channel, be well, be secure, and I'll see you next time around.